Hello and welcome to the lecture on the Spanish-American War and looking at why the Americans went to war and the new questions that the war created for America. And what you're looking at there is a picture of Theodore Roosevelt, future president of the United States, charging up San Juan Hill in Cuba, and he plays a very important role in this story, and we'll get to that in good time. All right, so we got some opening questions, and first off, when did American imperialism begin, and when did it end? What was the historical context that this expansion was taking place in? What were the main motivations for late 19th century imperial expansion, not just for the Americans, but all nations? And how did this imperial expansion call into question the essence of Americans' national identity? Who are we as a nation, or who are they as a nation? All right, so we define imperialism as the control over others and the denial of their sovereignty, whether through annexation or settlement or outright military occupation or just through threats. If this is our definition, and we'll go with this definition, then American imperial expansion really goes back to its very early foundings and its actions against Native peoples. Think about the Pequot War in Massachusetts or the Powhatan Wars in Virginia colonies. That was, the control over others. And with the Native American policy throughout the centuries really was an imperialistic policy of denial of people of their sovereignty and control over them. Yet, in this time period when the United States is going to acquire Hawaii and will acquire the Philippines and assert control over Cuba and Puerto Rico, it feels different than that. Philippines is on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, so there's very much a question of when, is this an extension of American expansion or is this something new altogether? All right, so what's happening around the world at this time in terms of imperial policy? Well, here we have a map showing the European claims over Africa and much of Asia, and it definitely was a time of renewed and a new imperialistic ambitions. And what this map is not showing, but properly what should, is Japan. Japan's also part of this expansion as well. And what's pushing this? Well, certainly economic reasons, economic motives of access to resources, access to markets. And if I don't have it, then somebody else will. And that's just no good because there was this fierce competition between these nations, especially Britain and Germany. And the idea of, survival of the fittest, we've seen it being applied in the business world and calling it social Darwinism. Well, here it's being applied at the international level. And finally, the idea of if you're going to be a powerful nation, then you need a navy that can exert power beyond your own borders. And what that then entails is you need coaling stations around the world. And a book that was published during this time was certainly making these arguments, and it was very popular. It's called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History by a man named Mahan. And Theodore Roosevelt was a friend of Mahan and definitely believed in this one and believed that America needed to expand beyond its borders and become a naval power both in the Atlantic and in the Pacific Ocean. Another way to remember it is some of these mnemonic devices, the 3Gs, the 5Ds, or the 6Ps, whichever one you want to take. And you've seen the 3Gs before, probably with the Spanish exploration of gold, God, and glory. And the 5Ds and the 6Ps really just expand on these: destiny, Darwinism, defense, dollars, democracy, and deity. Or the 6Ps: profits, patriotism, population, politics, piety, and paternalism. There, the democracy and the paternalism, sort of the idea that America needs to take these places so that we can take care of these people. And it's at this time that we get a reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine in the 1890s in the Caribbean world. And just a reminder that the Monroe Doctrine is an 1820s foreign policy declaration to Europe of you stay out of our area and we'll stay out of your area. And it was declared when much of the Spanish Empire was declaring its independence from Spain. And America was sort of reminding, the countries of Europe that you can't just sort of, when Spain leaves, you can walk in and take control, that these countries will be independent. And America could not enforce this, but Britain could, and what Britain wanted was access to these markets in South America, Latin America, that had been closed to them when they'd been part of the Spanish Empire. And, open them up for free trade for all. Now, in the 1890s, America can enforce it, which was evident with a border dispute between Venezuela and British Guyana. We don't need to go into the details of this. And now they're looking on, at Spain and the last of its empire in Latin America, principally Cuba and Puerto Rico. Now, Cuba, at this time, this is what's left of Spain's empire at this time. Philippines, over here, some islands in the Pacific, Puerto Rico, that's circled there, and Cuba. And Cuba was in revolt against the Spanish overlords. And they're led by a man named Jose Marti. They're doing it as guerrilla warfare. They're not a formal army. And Spain's answer by its commander Wheeler was, well, if the guerrillas are getting their support from the population, let's take away their population and let's move the population into camps where we can have total control over them. And they called them reconcentration camps. And these camps were horribly administered. And so that the food that was supposed to be provided for them was not, and there was a lot of starvation. And the Americans strongly sympathized with the Cuban insurrection and with the people in the camps. And American business are really watching things carefully as well. They've got a lot invested in Cuba, and they want to make sure that it's that their property will be taken care of. Here's one of the camps. And it's within this context that we have in the United States a press war, and especially between these two gentlemen, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. Pulitzer had a major newspaper, the New York World. Hearst had the New York Journal and a lot of other papers. He had the largest chain of newspapers in the United States, and he sort of mastered the sensationalist, gossipy journalism. And so they're fiercely competing for readers. And what do the readers want? Readers want exciting news. They're not necessarily concerned with an accurate story, but is it lurid? Is it evil? Is it sensational? And so these two papers are really playing up what's going on down in Cuba. And it's within this context that this happens. An American ship that had been sent to Cuba to protect Americans there and American interests there blew up. And what blew it up? Well, for these gentlemen here, it doesn't matter what blew it up. It's the Spanish who blew it up. And we see, this is Hearst's paper, Crisis at Hand, Spanish Treachery, Cabinet in Session, Growing Belief in Spanish Treachery. Delome in Panic Flees. He's the Spanish ambassador to the United States. And another one, Destruction of the Warship. Maine was the work of an enemy. And Assistant Secretary Roosevelt convinced the explosion of the warship was not an accident, and that it's Spanish. Now, what blew it up? Probably it blew up because of coal dust and being really close to the ammunition and getting like a powder fire and an explosion. That's probably the most likely thing. But what the public thinks is that the Spanish blew it up. And Teddy Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at this time, and very much putting out that he thought that the Spanish did it. So, pulling a republic into war. How are we going to get the public to support for the war? Well, the sinking of the Maine certainly helped. And the Delome letter. Now, what this was a letter from the Spanish ambassador to the United States, Delome, to the Spanish foreign minister, which criticized McKinley, President McKinley, and called McKinley weak. And this had been intercepted by the Cuban insurrectionists, and they had very quickly made it known to William Randolph Hearst, and it got published in the American newspapers. And the newspapers are very much pushing the public to war, because what's going to sell newspapers more than anything is an actual war. And 2 months after the sinking of the Maine, President McKinley, who did not want war, he'd fought in the Civil War, he saw what it was, he'd been at Antietam, but he does finally ask Congress to declare declare war to protect humanity, to protect life and property, and to protect American business interests in Cuba, and finally, the treachery of Spain, and they go to war. Now, Roosevelt, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, one day, boss is gone, and so he's in charge, and he had told Admiral Dewey, who commanded the American Pacific Fleet, which was stationed in Hong Kong, that if war is declared, you are to immediately go to Manila and destroy the Spanish fleet there. Now, Roosevelt had no authority to do this, but he did it anyways. And he's very much an expansionist and shoot first, ask question later kind of a guy. And this happened, and the battle in Manila Harbor was a complete victory for the United States. Not a single American Navy seaman was killed in this battle, and the entire Spanish fleet was destroyed. And it's sort of modern against traditional, a steel fleet versus a wood fleet. And there's the battle there. And Teddy Roosevelt put up or shut up. He quit as Assistant Navy Secretary and said, I'm going to go off to war. And he thought Americans were soft and that they needed a good old war. And he himself really felt he could not be a man until he'd fought in a war. And so he quit his job and he assembled this regiment that were known as the Rough Riders. And it's an odd group. It's a mix of sort of Western ranchers. Teddy Roosevelt had tried ranching for a while. And also Harvard people, TR's Harvard friends, because he'd also been to Harvard. And Teddy Roosevelt he'd been born into a rich family and had a very good upbringing and a very good education. But he mixes with all companies very well, and he's very much a leader. But he's also quite hated by others as well. And we'll get to him in good time. And off to war they went. And in Cuba, it was a complete kind of a debacle. It was a confused invasion. Teddy Roosevelt's horse was dropped into the ocean and it swam off in the wrong direction. And, they didn't land properly. The logistics were a nightmare. They weren't properly supplied and equipped. And more died from disease in the war. Americans died from tropical diseases than from military fighting. Yet, they won. And they'd won easily, and for Spain, they just couldn't fight a power like the United States. And the war, two-phase war, okay, they've gotten the Philippines, they've gotten the Cubans. We'll talk more about Hawaii and what this means for Hawaii in the next lecture. Now peace. And should they take the Philippines? And when the Philippines resist Americans taking them, what does that mean as well? And, so they've won this war. Can they win the peace? And like the Civil War, winning a war and enforcing peace are two very different things. And so the war is really only going to create new problems. And we'll get to those questions and those problems in the next lecture. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you again.